Hello and welcome. My name is Xander. I will be your instructor through this tutorial. Now, this tutorial is actually part of a whole course which you can access the first stages for free here on YouTube. Now, in this tutorial, I might mention resources and other tutorials. Do check out the link in the video description, which will take you to the playlist, and also there will be a link to the resources so that you can access and follow along here on YouTube. Now, if you like this course, you found it useful, and you want to take that next step, you can find this course over at Udemy. All the links to the resources can be found in the video description. Now, don't forget, also subscribe to the channel for weekly promotions, discounts, and free course giveaways. If you have been following along step by step, at this point, we have learned fundamentals for inserting, updating, and deleting data. So let's now take a look at loading data or inserting data from different formats. There will be occasions where you already have the data you want to insert into the database. That might come in the format of JSON, CSV, or many other formats. So what we're going to do here is take a look at inserting data, bulk inserting data into the database from a JSON file. A JSON or JavaScript object notation is extremely popular and widely used for various purposes, including extracting from data from APIs, or potentially saving data or backing up data from a database into this format. The plan for this tutorial, first of all, we need to create some JSON data for a table or each table in our database. So we need to line up our JSON code so that it correlates to the fields in our tables. Now, I have already completed this task. I will show you the JSON, and then you can utilize that to maybe add your own. The second task, we're going to need to update the Docker Compose file to include a volume. And that's going to allow us to access a folder, a defined folder from our local machine over into the container, so that the container will have access to a folder we are saving and storing data locally on our machine. And that way it can access our Postgres database, in the Docker container, can access the JSON data to insert it into the database. And then finally, we need to prepare and insert the data from our JSON files. Right, so if you have downloaded the source code for this module, you will find a folder called DB Data. Inside of here, you can see there is a JSON and CSV file for each of the tables that we have already created. In the next tutorial, we'll take a look at inserting data from CSV, which is typically an easier task than JSON. But we'll start with JSON because, like I said, it is a very popular format. Right, so opening up the category file, we will only insert the category data. You can go ahead and expand the code in this tutorial and insert as many of the tables data as you like, because it should all fit. I haven't tested it fully, but it should be okay. Right, so as you can see, we open up this JSON file. A JSON or JavaScript object notation. This is a lightweight, very human-readable data format used for storing and exchanging data. It's commonly used in web applications, APIs, and of course databases. If we inspect the JSON code, you can see that I've wrapped up what will eventually be a record in these curly braces, and separated by a comma. And you can see within this construct, we have an ID parent name slug is active and level, and that represents, if you take a look at the category table, that represents the fields that we find in the category table. So we're simply lining up the code in order to insert that directly into the category table. If you are creating your own JSON, it's important to remember here that you can see that numbers will not have doubles, but strings will be placed within double or single quotes. In actual fact, that is a complete lie. Here in JSON, doubles is strictly required for the keys here on the left-hand side and the string values. Okay, so in regards to the JSON data, you can see that the file was a .json file. You can see how we constructed the data. Each of those elements in the JSON files will then be converted into a row in the database. So we now need to make this data available to our container our Postgres database in our Docker container. So for that, we're going to need to create a volume. Right, so back into the code. Let's go over to the Docker Compose file. So currently we don't have a volume. What we're going to do now is, you probably already see in the examples here, we have a separate Docker file for different reasons. Here we have a Docker Compose file for when we want to create a volume and map a folder from our local machine over to the container. And that's exactly what we have here. So from now on, we're going to use this Docker Compose file, and I'll show you how to utilize that shortly. But take a look at what we've done here. Within the Postgres service, we have added a new volume. And there are different types of volumes. In this specific case, here in our Docker Compose file, what we've done is we mapped across our dot. So this is in reference from this file, dot referring to this folder that the Docker Compose file here currently resides in. The slash referring to a new folder, and that folder is called DB Data, so that correlates to our DB Data folder. So what we're doing here is we're mapping across this folder over to a folder on our Postgres database container called Data. So in our container, we will have a folder called Data, which we will map across this data in the DB Data from our local machine. And what that means is that anytime I update this DB Data folder, it will also be updated in the container. And likewise, when we save anything in the container in this folder, it will appear locally and saved locally here in my local DB Data folder. So this is going to be a really handy, convenient way of getting data into my container and also removing data from the container and then saving it locally here. We use this approach when we save or back up our database. We can save it directly to this folder, which will then save it directly locally here in our folder. Right, so that's the only change we need to make, but of course we will now need to restart Docker. Head over to Docker Desktop, just make sure we just manually delete all of the containers. Once that's done, we'll go ahead and restart. Right, so now when we start Docker, what we're going to need to do, well, important to remember that we have been returned back to the terminal on our local machine. So we're no longer within the container if you were. So what's important to remember now is that we need to select this Docker Compose file to run when we start our container. So to do that, we're going to run Docker Compose as per normal, but use the flag. And that's going to allow us to select the Docker Compose file that we want to run when starting the container. And that's going to be our Docker Compose with data.yaml. So we will need the .yaml at the end there. And then we can just go ahead and use the normal commands up to bring up the container, and D so we can run it in the background and we don't release the terminal to the container, so we can still access our terminal. Looks like we've got an issue there. I think there was a few issues because how the command was set. Okay, maybe not. So Docker Compose with data.yaml. Okay, so we're told here that no such file or directory. Okay, so let's just ls. So that's going to list all the files. So just double check where we are. So yeah, it looks like we are in the right place. So let's just Docker Compose. Let's run that again with the flag. So let's go Docker Compose dash with database. Apologies. So database data. I had the wrong file completely, didn't I? YAML up and D. There we go. Right, so the container has now started. That should now mirror across. We can inspect that. If you go into the containers, look for the inventory database. Let's go over to files. And then if you remember, it should be in the, well, it was slash, if you remember, in the Docker Compose file, which represents this root directory, and then data. So inside of here, you can see that we have all of the data that we have saved locally that we've now mirrored across. And you can see that it is a bind mount, suggesting that we have mounted that within our Docker Compose file. That is the second step completed. Now we need to prepare and insert the data from JSON. Unlike, for example, a CSV file, inserting JSON into Postgres is a little bit more is a little bit more, what's the word, is a little bit more, it's just a little bit more work than a CSV file, as we will find out in the next tutorial. Nevertheless, like I said, it is a very popular format and we can definitely use it to insert data into the database. So let's give this a go. Right, so I have already pre-written the code, but I want to take you through this step by step and fully explain it. So what you'll see here is an approach where we're going to test first to make sure that the data is correctly located, and we're just going to select and return the data. Now remember, our goal here is to take the JSON file, which is going to contain an array of objects. Let's use the right terminology now. So we have this array of objects. So we have the square brackets, an array of objects. So each object is represented by these curly braces. Each object is going to be converted into a row, in this case, into the category table. So let's break this down. Right, so first of all, we're going to use with. Remember, this is SQL. Here we are using Common Table Expression, CTE. Right, so the with clause, this defines a common table expression, which is going to allow us to create a temporary result set that we can then use in the main select query. So with JSON Data as, we haven't yet spoken about aliases, and we will do later, I think, in this course. In SQL, AS is used for aliasing, which means giving a temporary name to a table or column. In this context of common table expressions, AS defines the result set that would later be referenced in the query. Right, so let's now actually read the contents of, in this case, the category.json file. So to read the contents of our file, we're going to use the pg read file. Okay, so that's going to allow us to read data from a file. So our data is going to be found in the data folder, as we've seen, and then we have a file called category.json in this case. Now what we're going to do here is actually convert this into JSONB, which essentially is a way of converting this data into a binary format, which is just going to allow us to work with this data more efficiently. I've always found that with Postgres, it's just preferable to perform this task over working with JSON so that we can work with it in Postgres. But like I said, it basically decomposes the JSON into binary format, which can be more efficient for, like I said, querying and manipulation. Right, so at this point, we have somewhere to save the results so that we can query and actually view what we have returned from the JSON file. And we have a way of reading the data, which we've now converted into JSON binary. Okay, so now the magic bit, if you like, we're going to need to turn these objects into rows so that we can then insert them into the database. So that's where we're going to need JSONB array elements. Right, so because we have converted into JSONB, we've got a whole bunch of other tools that we can use. One of them is this JSONB array elements function, which will break a JSON array into individual elements. And then, of course, once we've done that, we can then make an array of rows that we can then insert into our database. So from JSONB array elements, so this is going to return a set of JSON objects. What we can do here is we need to wrap up our pg read file, and then we can use an alias here at the end. So as, for example, data. So we're giving this an alias for the output column. This allows for easy reference working with the data. And we want to make sure that we select everything from this file. So apologies, I forgot that. So we select, as we're familiar with, select all. So we select all from this file. We save it in this JSON data so that we can then go ahead and work with it, i.e. insert it into the database, or potentially just print it out like we're going to do first. So now we've got this data saved here in this JSON data. You might like to think of JSON data at this point as a temporary result set, which we can now perform additional queries on. And that's obviously what we're going to do right now. So hopefully at this point, everything is working, and that's what we're trying to do ultimately, isn't it? We're trying to test and make sure that we have set this up properly before we insert it into the database. So we can now do select from, and then our temporary data set. So hopefully if we run this, this should now, hey. If we run it there, it won't work, of course. We're going to need to log in. So if you can't remember, have a look in the first tutorial. You'll find all the commands to log in as Postgres. And then, of course, we need to connect to the database because that's the database we're going to be using. And then let's run this. And now you can see that we return all the results from the, if we were to inspect that and check it against the JSON file, we now have everything ready for us to insert into our database table, the category table. Right, so now we have successfully extracted the data. Let's make sure that, well, let's add it into the category table, sorry. So we know that this is where the data is at. So we're now going to insert into, as we've learned previously, and it's a category table. So we specify the fields. So this needs to line up with the JSON data, of course, else this won't work correctly. So we line all the data up, and now we need to add the values. But this time it's slightly different because we're going to be using select. Okay, let me just change that one more time. So we use select. So this is where our alias comes into play. So it's data. We're referencing our data as JSON data as data. So that's going to allow us to reference the data for us to extract it. And what we're trying to do here with this select is exactly that. We're trying to extract the JSON values so we can then insert it into our table. So this query essentially converts the JSON data into structured SQL data types. And you can start to see what's happening here. We grab our data, the ID. That's a reference to the data that we have extracted from our JSON file in one of the objects. And then you can see that we're going to cast this to an integer. Okay, so we're going to need to specify the data types. And you can see that the name and the slug, we don't specify the data types because the default is going to be a string or a character field or a varchar. And then we have is active a Boolean, and then the data level is going to be a small int. Okay, so we're simply just extracting from our data, preparing it, casting it to the correct data types, and then we're going to insert it into the category table. The last thing is to create the from, specify from, select from, and that's obviously the JSON data. So we select the JSON data and we reference the data in JSON data as data, and then the different data points within that format. And then we specify the data types where necessary, unless they are already a string, the default data type. And there we go. So that will hopefully now extract and insert into the category table. So I guess we just need to give that a go now. Right. So I'm just going to copy and paste this in, make sure obviously you're connected to the right database. And it looks like we have an error. Now, you may have already guessed what the problem is here. We haven't actually created our tables yet because we restarted our Docker container. Remember, that will mean that we will need to recreate the whole database again because it isn't saved when we remove the container. So I'm just going to copy and paste the code from 2 here. That's obviously all the tables. And now we have all the tables in, we can go ahead and insert the data. And there we go. So we've now inserted 11 records. We can inspect the table set. You can see that we have all the tables back, and then we can inspect the category table, which should have, inspect the table if we need to. Apologies, that wasn't what I wanted, was it? And then we can go ahead and select all from category and view all the data. Don't forget the semicolon. There we go. So that then has successfully extracted and inserted the data from our JSON file. Right, so now what you need to do is copy that out for all the different tables. You then need to make an initialization script so that when Docker container starts with PostgreSQL, it runs and builds all the tables and then inserts all the data. I just like saying all you need to do because it always sounds nice and easy, but we will do that in actual fact. I've just added that to the end of this module as a new tutorial. So I'll take you through the process of, or I'll show you how to set up an initialization script. And when our Postgres container starts, it will create the tables automatically and insert all the data. But first, let's take a look at the next tutorial where we discuss CSV files, because it is actually easier to work with CSV data than it is JSON. So let's take a look.